Welcome to the Leadership Passport podcast, where we dive into journeys, challenges, and insights of school and education leaders from around the world. I'm delighted today to introduce my guest, Louka Parry. Louka is an education futurist, learning and leadership strategist. A former teacher, became a school principal at 27 years old, was named Inspirational Public Secondary Teacher of the Year, a top 40 leader under 40 for South Australia, and a top 100 Australian Innovator in 2022. He has since trained thousands of educators and leaders globally to increase their positive impact. Welcome, Louka.
Kevin, great to be with you. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. So, if your leadership style were a song or a movie, what would it be and why?
Such a great icebreaker question. I actually think it would be any of the fantastic, I'm going to say it's a Hans Zimmer movie score. And that could be Inception, or it could be Batman. It could be any of the brilliant kind of movie scores. I guess the reason for that is there's something that fascinates me about emergence and the generative social field, or the space that's created between things, between ideas, but absolutely between people. And so there's something about each part of a system, in this case a symphony, playing a small role that creates something that is absolutely beautiful and kind of in some ways impossible to replicate without all of those particular features. And so getting a bit philosophical, but that would absolutely be kind of, and the build towards something that's really powerful and beautiful, the climate, and then of course the beautiful conclusion to that. And that cycle playing out over and over again, be every bar, every phrase, or kind of every song.
Fantastic. Amazing. So I'd like to start talking a little bit about your leadership journey and what inspired you to become an international or school education leader.
Kevin, I spent a couple of years in Europe. I'm from Adelaide, South Australia, and I spent a couple of years in Europe pretty well straight after high school. And it became sufficiently clear to me that my level of curiosity was actually one of my strengths. And I remember returning to Europe, in some ways a little shocked by my worldview, having grown up in an Australian city, which is quite a long way from other parts of the world, as you well know. And so, I think what the inspiration for me was, well, what might I do that enables me to share my curiosity in a really beautiful way? And so I changed out of a few other options, commerce and others, to become an educator, and definitely, dived into the languages realm, which I loved. Drama, physical education, so anything around embodied cognition, I was very interested in, and still am. And so that's kind of what took me on that road, and to choose education, was realizing that it is an incredible way to make an impact. And it's also a vehicle through which I can continually explore the things that light me up the most. And of course, when you're fully alive as a human being, that's also when you're the most inspirational. It's when you're, there's a kind of je ne sais quoi. There's something in the air, the fabric of an experience, which is quite magical. It'd be that flow psychology, whatever we call it, in the zone, in the pocket is my favorite saying at the moment, Kevin, from jazz music, when you drop into something that's quite beautiful. That's what took me into education. Then leadership really was just me following my own curiosity, and my curiosity of, okay, well, what does it mean to make an impact at a class level, and then an organization level, then a system level? And now in some ways, and in some projects that I work on, at a global level. And so there was no, I'm going to be leader X at age Y. It was very much, okay, well, what is mine to do? Which is a question I constantly reflect upon. What is mine to do right now? And of course, a great way to notice and answer that is, where am I finding myself most alive? That beautiful synthesis, the nexus of strength and curiosity. Because intellectual curiosity is one of those great pillars that I think we do not pay enough attention to.
And I love how you framed it as sharing your curiosity with others, because quite often we think of curiosity as an individual trait, or as a selfish, a wonderful quality, but not something that we share with others. So I loved how you framed it in that way.
Well, Kevin, I think my belief, you would not perhaps be surprised, is that there is no true self, because the self only exists in contrast or comparison to another self. And this is the whole notion of systems, and so for me, the fact that we can speak in English in this instance is creates the self, because I'm using arbitrary pops and whistles out of my mouth, which you understand. So this idea that everything in our entire world is around understanding our relationships. Now, you can have a self-relationship, and there is the individuation process, which is core for our work in education. With all of your students at your school, how do you enable each of them to grow into the most unique version of themselves? And of course, why would we want them to do that? so they can uniquely contribute into something beyond themselves. And so that for me is kind of the layers that I think about a lot, right? Like understanding relationship, contrast, compare, you know, and in that way we end up with the true diversity of our universe, but of our human systems too, right? Great performing team, diverse, even if it's skill matrix, it's everyone is doing their thing to do in a synergistic way, which means we're all heading in the same direction. Now, having been a classroom teacher, sometimes everyone's heading in a different direction. That's pretty tough work. But of course, that's also the magic of that emergent space, the learning space.
Can you identify a defining moment in your leadership journey so far, something that really stands out to you as a pivotal moment?
I feel like every day is a defining moment, if I'm honest with you. But I will answer your question in a proper way. And I'll go back to my time as a newly appointed school leader, and very enthusiastic, Kevin, very young, inexperienced, but with strong social capital in the community where I was leading, and certainly internally. And I think the realization from me was, and I guess this is why I do the work I do now, it was realizing that actually my frame of reference or my mental model is as much like an important empirical terrain as it is a prison. So like finding out all these things that as a school leader I was not conscious of as a teacher or as a kind of deputy or middle leader was a really impactful moment in my life. And I realized actually saying I don't know as a leader is a pretty potent thing to say. And without getting too detailed, the defining moment that really comes to me, end of my first term, was just this moment at the school where I was made aware through a student, kind of a disclosure really, of some really horrific abuse that was taking place at the community level. And it kind of just completely floored me, Kevin, because I kind of had this optimistic, the world is rainbows and it's all going, we're going to, so it just actually really brought reality right into my realm, my awareness. And so how I responded in that moment, I think was a real act of leadership. And it's something I really think about, like how do we traverse the tragedy that sometimes is the reality in which we work or we live in the world, this brutal, tragic world, and yet see the incredible acts of generosity and possibility. And so to bind together as a coherent team to work in service of something, despite or even because of those challenges that we see.
All your work that you do across cultures and across countries, is there a particular aha moment that crystallized for you? You mentioned you were talking before in terms of initial travel to Europe and opening your eyes to different things and some realizations. Is there something that stands out to you across cultures that shaped the work that you do today?
It's actually that, well, two things. And of course, they're paradoxical, Kevin. The first is context is queen. The closer that we get to a learning experience, the more important context becomes. So the closer to the classroom we are, the more important context is. But in the same breath, there is a really clear universality to the human experience. And it's one that I reflect on often because, of course, I work across this. So how do I make my work relevant across all these different cultures? And it's to talk about the universal principles that underpin great learning, great leadership, human growth and development, and even, eudaimonia and kind of the concept of flourishing or fulfillment itself. So that was my aha moment, Kevin. I've traveled, 85 odd countries, and when I go to them, I'm always like, cool, what's the same? What's different? And what I realize is actually a lot is the same. That's an interesting thing. Beyond the representation and celebration of human diversity, which I am a big believer in, is actually the commonality, and I think we sometimes get stuck in the diversity space without realizing actually we're all living the same human experience. And I think that one of my theses, I guess, is like that's where we see breakdown, is where we end up in tribalism, as opposed to seeing unity and trying to develop a unity consciousness, or even the conceptualization of actually we're all in this together. We live on one blue dot, a sphere that's flying through the universe at multiple speeds, depending on your vantage point. We're not stationary. We're not the center of the universe at all. And so that would be my kind of moment, is realizing the design features actually are pretty simple. But of course, bringing them into complex human systems is where the real genius is, That's why I love to work with school leaders and schools to help their journey there, because it's kind of trying to remember, not just invent. It really is around kind of, I think, self-remembering, especially when we look at our Indigenous knowledge systems and what they might say.
Fantastic. And I couldn't agree with you more. I loved how you framed it in terms of that commonality that exists between a lot of us. And, having worked in the Middle East, China, Australia, you come to the increasing realization we have much more in common than we do different. Parents who love their children, teachers who want to find a sense of fulfillment and purpose, communities, people who want to have a sense of belonging in their community. That kind of exists everywhere, regardless of language or other things that you were speaking
Mm.
about.
It's like a beautiful quote as well. I think of Mark Twain, but who knows if Mark Twain actually said anything, But everything he gets something. It's something about travel, right? Travel is fatal to bigotry, ignorance, and small-mindedness. And he talks about how being able to challenge our own self, our own concept, it's just such a, I mean, really, it's a fundamental human, it's part of the human experience, but so often it's also a privilege thing. So people that don't have expert, you can't be what you can't see is one of the ways that we talk about this, or the unknown unknowns. We just don't know what we don't know. And this is why I like Gert Biester. We talk about student-centered education all the time, but actually we need world-centered education. We need to help young people imagine beyond their current understanding, not just what's relevant for them today, but what is possible for them tomorrow. And so that tension is one that I think we work with all the time. Because you want to engage young people. You also want to take them into unknown terrain, because that's the expansive piece of education. Otherwise, we just end up kind of at the probable future instead of our preferred version of our life path or our career or whatever the case might be.
And you were talking before a little bit about the realities of leadership and some challenges as a young leader. What's the toughest leadership challenge you've ever faced, and how did you see your way through it?
Similarly, it would be being a young principal in a complex setting. And how did I navigate it? Honestly, by doing it together with others. And so I really do. I'm not so sure. I do believe in the hero's journey for all human beings every single day. We go through a hero's journey, but I'm not so sure about the kind of the heroic individual. I think there's something about uh, Mandela's line, I come from a family of shepherds, I lead from behind. And so for me, it was just feeling the immense responsibility of the well-being and learning outcomes of an entire school community. And sometimes, because it was a community school, the entire community myself. And so I guess also like moving from permissive leadership to authoritative leadership, Kevin, I would say like my own sense of boundaries. Like, how do I be curious and convicted? Again, somewhat paradoxical, So I think this kind of the space that I still grapple with and I'm curious by. But yeah, it was leading a team and knowing that the buck stopped with me. And then, okay, great. And the impact that can have on overall well-being. And in Australia, we just had our national data come out, as it does each year, for the well-being of our school leaders. And it's the worst it's ever been. And, with 1 in 2 saying that they're trying to leave. And so, we need to totally reconceptualize. Reform won't get us there. We need to totally reconceptualize the idea of what a school is and how we support each other, adults, young people, to do that work better.
And you were talking just now about grappling with situations or circumstances or things that present themselves to you. What's one mistake that's shaped your leadership approach?
I would say, I'm going to use gross language here, but it's like understanding the stakeholders. Right. I've made many mistakes, Kevin, in my time by not understanding the impact that an action of mine would have on another person. And it's probably just sometimes it's a capacity issue, but sometimes as well, it's wanting to believe a more convenient lie than the inconvenient truth. And so, I think all my mistakes are really just around a lack of awareness and a lack of conscious decision making. And so the way I would do that now is I would have deeper empathy and understand somebody's sense of loss, especially when it's a loss of identity. And as school leaders all the time, we're playing with identity. And so if we don't say I'm an educator, we say I'm a science teacher. And then all of a sudden, if we say, well, we're doing transdisciplinary learning, we have no such thing as science as a construct. Well, there's a massive loss of identity there. So that, I think, is my ongoing lesson and the mistakes that I may have made is to understand the grief process that comes from change and to be able to head that off in a more strategic way. And this is why I think things like co-design, Kevin, I'm really interested in. How do we come together? And the only thing more powerful than creating being inside and running, cool, we're going to consult with people. It's actually for it to be done by them. Right. And that's why I'm a real believer in this idea of co-construction. If we want to change a culture, have the people design the culture they want to be with. And if you can frame that in the right way, often it's exactly the same direction that we want.
So sometimes when we make mistakes or missteps as leaders, then we kind of question, well, look, what on earth am I doing? Do I even know what I'm doing? And leads to, imposter syndrome. How do you deal with, maybe you don't suffer from imposter syndrome, but
I'm a human being, and as someone that has high performance syndrome, I definitely had imposter syndrome for a lot of my life. I would say I'm probably the most comfortable I am with myself, Kevin. And I think it's why I think questions like what's mine to do really light me up, because it's around validating where I am, honestly, and the uniqueness that I am. And it's the same for every single human being. But yeah, the idea of an imposter syndrome, in some ways, it's how can we be imposters of who we are? And so the more, and I fully believe that. I heard from Peter Senge as well at a conference a few days ago. It's totally true. Like, leadership development is actually personal development that's applied to a professional context. You think about our leadership program, like they are all around developing the self, because leadership emanates from the self outwards, notwithstanding the self-delusion that we talked about before. So this idea that, what's mine to do? And imposter syndrome for me, I still have the same things. My work isn't that quality or whatever. But I'll tell you one thing that I do, and it might be really useful for your listeners too, is I use a couple of different types of, might call them therapeutic techniques. One I call cosmic time perspective, right? Which is you zoom out and you realize, and you basically zoom out in the tiny 100-year lifespan, if we're lucky, that we get. And you go all the way back and then up, and you go, well, 14, 15 billion years. You're like, well, actually, my life probably isn't that significant. And the other one I do is spatial perspective, which is, again, you zoom out. That's why I love The Pale Blue Dot by Carl Sagan. Because it just really says, actually, no one really knows what the universe, we don't even know if the universe knows what it's doing, and that's everything as far as we're aware, including dark matter and the quantum realm and blah, blah, blah. So yeah, that's my answer to that is, it does happen, but it happens when my ego is activated. And so much of our work as leaders is to realize, to come from spirit or from like a deeper sense of purpose, rather than the egoic, I'm worse or better than somebody else. It's saying, well, actually, this is uniquely my thing. When we stand in our uniqueness, Kevin, my goodness, we can make things happen almost feel magically, And that's, I think, our role as leaders, when we are totally in the pocket, when we're locked in, and we're like, this is mine to do, and I'm going to go and do it. And you can look at most of the social change that I've studied in the world, and I would say that's people that understand what they're here to do. They go and do it.
Is there a leadership practice or habit that has changed the game for you?
So many. I'll just give you the bucket of them, Kevin. Psychophysiology. Friends, and a lot of our work does this, Kevin, too, right? It's like we have lost connection with the biggest technology that we ever invented, ever emerged, and it's our body. 100 trillion cells, 86 billion neurons. And we're like, oh, I better have another coffee, which I do drink, by the way. So pay attention to your physiology and your psychology. That's the human software and hardware, not just the AI tool that's emerging. That's great. Go play with ChatGPT, do all the things, generative AI, yes, efficiency dividend, blah, blah, blah. But it's actually, remember that your body is the foundation upon which your cognition is built. And so sleep well, get your exercise in, and eat real food, nutrient rich. Just those are the vitality factors, Kevin, I tell you. And so then you can do things like meditation, which I also do. I run, I gym, I work my body hard, so that creates a foundation upon which I can create. And that's the leadership practice all of us need. You look at school leaders, they are often stressed. Sometimes they're not in the physical shape they would want. And you're like, well, that's not going to enable resilience, let alone anti-fragility. So yeah, I could lecture on that for a long time, but it's hard to find, hard to make the time, but we need to.
Yeah. And look, it's something that almost every successful leader that I speak to, that's a prominent part of their schedule and their routine, and they make the time for it no matter what else is going on, because they realize, exactly like you said, everything else is based upon that. And if you don't get that right, how can you expect to think clearly and,
we can't
function properly in the world?
And we're also human. And so the other part of that is forgiveness. Oh my gosh, Kevin, one of the pieces I ask people around their self-forgiveness categorically across our research. I've worked with thousands of leaders. Gets the lowest response. What is your capability to forgive yourself? Very low. And yet self-forgiveness is actually how we let go to call in. So if we're carrying allostatic load that's not ours, stress that's not ours, we must forgive ourselves and others so that we can function as best we can in this very complex world.
Interesting. So if we sort of cast our minds then to the future of education and school leadership, how do you see international educational school leadership evolving over the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, I would say I had Ollie Pecker, who's the head of the IB, on our podcast, I guess last year. And so I kind of asked him the same question. And so I think you'd look at the big organizations and where they're trying to go. But of course, there's a whole range of different scenarios that might play out. I'm just going to share our top line, right? And because it's a piece of work that we've been talking about. So there are things that will change the learning experience, are changing it, but must be more understood. For us, it's the ABCs: agency, belonging, curiosity, discernment, embodiment. And they equal F, which is flourishing, right? So I know it's a bit naff, but it's a shorthand way of understanding the underlying principles of what I think the future of learning will be. And I use them as principles because contextually they'll all look quite different depending on where you are and who you are. But that I think is where, as leaders, we must become futurists as well, Kevin. This is what I'm going to double down on. It's the work I do. Is how do you, as an educator, understand futures literacies? Because the better you can think as a futurist, the more able you are to create change, because you're not so wedded to a past paradigm or a mental model. You're not captured by it. You're not a victim of it. You're a creator of it, and you understand that. And so I would love, and I'm trying to play this role, but to take all school leaders on this journey to really understand futures literacies, to understand multiple perspectives, to be global in their view and local in their action. And I think that's I think where we're heading in terms of a very quick response to international ed and school leadership.
Fantastic. And maybe you've just answered this now, but a piece of advice you'd give to an aspiring school or education leader?
Yeah, it would be, well, actually two things, Kevin. Number one is make your own development the greatest priority. So it's the thesis I have, like it's the learn-it-alls that will go further than the know-it-alls. So what you know, be humble, and the learning, be open and be relentless at discovery. And then, of course, it's going from the learning to the integration to the embodiment, which is a whole other piece of work. And the second piece is, to delve into futures, as I have done in kind of really in the last 5 years since some time at the Stanford D School, where I go, oh, wow, this is work I never knew about with 2 master's degrees and hadn't encountered before. And I think it's incredibly powerful. Design thinking meets strategic foresight. And then we're really thinking about how we might redesign school and learning systems rather than reform them, from within a captured kind of ideology.
If you had a magic wand, one thing that you might change about international education or school leadership?
Oh, that's a great question. I'll wave. Here's a thesis I'm working on. I would shift towards a fully human way of understanding success. So a lot of international schools, they're beautifully diverse, but they still might have a kind of the academic paradigm driving the cognitive paradigm. And I really would love there to be a kind of different credential system which doesn't rank young people, but it matches them to what's theirs to do in the world, including economically. And so that would be the wave. I think if we did that and we shift the credential system away from this standardized, okay, you got 41 and you got 36, or all the different, GCSEs, whatever you want to look at, right? GPA. I think that would really unlock the kind of real human uniqueness, potential that exists in our schools.
Amazing. Sounds like a wonderful place to me.
Yeah, well, we're trying to build it, aren't we, Kevin? You're doing it now.
All right. So a couple of quick questions to wrap things up now. Your favorite book on leadership?
I have so many. So I'm just going to share the last one that I read is called 4,000 Weeks. And again, I think personal development is leadership development. And this is about how you spend your 4,000 weeks on this planet in your life. And so it's a very powerful book by Oliver Burkeman, and I recommend it to every leader.
One thing you do daily that helps you to lead better?
I meditate 20 minutes. And again, it just gives me time to for my subconscious to sort through my thoughts.
A leader, past or present, you admire?
I have so many. I think for me, yeah, I'm actually going to use a personal example, and it's one of my current mentors, who at 74 his name's Tony Mackay, and at 74 he has some of the highest vitality of anybody. He is so purpose driven, and whereas others choose to retire, he is like so vehemently focused on trying to make an impact in the world.
And finally, best advice you've ever received?
So much good stuff. I like a mantra that I'll share that I've heard. It's forgive yourself every night and recommit every morning. And there's something about that, the allowing, the letting go and calling in, which I think enables us to be fully here, fully present. And that's, I think, where we do our best work as leaders.
Amazing. Well, look, thanks so much, Luke. I really appreciated your time today. It's been lovely to chat with you. Thank you so much.
Kevin, an absolute pleasure, mate. Keep going.
Thanks so much for listening to the episode. If you enjoyed this conversation, don't forget to subscribe, like, follow, etc. Drop a comment below to let me know anything you'd like covered in upcoming episodes or suggestions for future guests. You can also connect with me on Instagram and LinkedIn.